And we're live.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ICHRRF Professor Ved Nanda Training Fellowship Program. We are meeting here on Saturday morning in India and Friday evening in US for our weekly seminar series for the ICHRRF. This is our logo. And on behalf of the Board of Directors and the executive team of the ICHRRF, I invite our audience to yet another seminar in the Professor Ved Nanda Fellowship Training Program. So this is our distinguished faculty led by Professor Ved Nanda, Professor Pathak, who has joined today, Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Veruthani, myself, Mr. Carl Clemens, who is our Executive Director and today's Faculty Preceptor, Mr. Hardam Tripathi, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, Professor Nidhi Shandurnikar, and Dr. Richard Bankins. We have two fellows currently, Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri, who joined in January 22 batch, and Mrs. Anushri Gisard, who joined us in July of 2022. Our seminar series has a very standard format. First 25 minutes, there's a presentation by the fellow, followed by a 10 minutes expert comments by our chief mentor, Professor Ved Nanda. This is followed by a 25 minutes discussion by the faculty preceptor, and last 30 minutes are for questions and answers. Sometimes we make changes in this format specifically to accommodate Professor Nanda because he is very busy, he's giving lectures everywhere. So sometimes he has to run from one lecture to the other. So in order to accommodate his schedule, we make changes. The topic of today's seminar is Polycentricity and Pagan Cultures in America. And as I said, today is Friday, July 22nd, 2022. The presenter for today's seminar is Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri, and faculty preceptor is Mr. Carl Clemens. Mr. Carl Clemens is heavily published in this area. If you check our website, there's a very detailed academic paper by Mr. Clemens on polycentricity. A few announcements just to bring everyone to current level of information. The ICHRRF issued a press release on recent hate crimes and violence against non-Muslim minorities in Bangladesh. The chairperson of our International Advisory Board, Professor Ved Nanda, will be delivering a lecture on concerns about anti-Indian House Resolution 1196 on Saturday, July 23rd at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time or 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daytime on a platform called Foundation for India and Indian Diaspora Studies, or FEEDS. House Resolution 1196 has been introduced by a controversial member of the House of Representatives in the United States who recently visited Pakistan. Nobody knows who paid for the trip. And since her trip to Pakistan, she has been bringing resolutions in the United States Congress that are directed against a particular religion and a particular culture. And that reflects an instinctive, reflexive hate and bias against a particular religion. I've already made the announcement that our new fellow, Mrs. Anushri Gisart, joined us on July 1st. We have applications open for January 2023 session for fellowship training. We might release a special hearing report on Kashmiri Hindu genocide either later this month or next month. And we are inviting volunteer faculty members if anyone is interested. A few housekeeping rules. Everyone should keep themselves on mute to avoid noise interference. Change your cell phone setting to vibration mode because sometimes if you are not on mute and your cell phone rings, it disturbs the seminar. Please don't try to interrupt our fellow or esteemed faculty. We allow only those members of audience who identify themselves openly to pose questions. All the questions have to be sent through chat function. We request you to be very precise and specific in asking a question. Don't make general comments in the form of a lecture. Every seminar is recorded and the video recording is available on our YouTube channel within next 24 hours. So with that introduction, I invite our fellow Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri to make his presentation. And Ripudaman,
Yeah,
please go ahead.
thank you, Adityanji. Thank you, Adityanji. Um, I will start with just a little introduction of what the paganism is. Everyone knows it. My presentation will mostly be about how it is rising in United States, the legal aspects, paganism in the education system, how pagan followers were persecuted around the world and in United States, and the different aspects, how it is rising in different parts of the society and in the medical system. As per the definition, like Oxford Dictionary definition, anyone who is not following the major religions of the world are pagans. It was like the term first were introduced by the Romans in third century, I guess, where the meaning um, of it is uh, it was a term used for the non-believers. Those who are not believing in the Christianity were called as pagans. It has a parallel term in other religions also, like in Islam, kafirs has almost the same meaning as pagan. But essentially, it's um, religion or practices followed by different communities, small and sometimes very small and sometimes substantially big, around the world. They were um, uh, basically uh, a believer of many gods, or you know and they sometimes they had the common belief of uh, uh, like there is a soul in every entity in this world, whether it's a living or non-living entity, like a stone or water. It has life in it, it has soul in it. That's one of the common belief, and another belief is like, uh, everything has divinity in it, uh, and so like in many Vedic traditions like Hinduism, people used to worship um, um, natural, uh, anything which is a living, like a mountain or a tree or an animal figure. That's in nutshell pagan religion is all about. Uh, some of these uh, pagan, uh, not some, all almost every pagan religion has faced persecution by the dominating religion of that time, and some part of the world they are still facing it. Um, the some of these practices or the believers of these religion have been totally eliminated or destroyed over the period of over the persecution of 1,000 years. Some of uh, the believers or the pagan practitioners have survived, like Vedic tradition, Sanatan Dharma or the Hindus survived. The main reason that um, I think is there are um, there are some certain practices like documenting the civilization, doing research on various aspects of life around a human being, whether it's a social, political affair, whether it's a medicine, whether it's a nature or astronomy, whatever. So they had a culture of developing rishis or the scientists who were who did um, a lot of research in the field of medical science and art of war, politics, economics, and whatnot, and they were successful in documenting those literature. They also had like a teacher-student relationship or parampara, guru-shishya parampara, where um, guru used to or the teacher used to teach on a particular subject and ask their um, disciples or students to do research on write research paper on the same paper about their understanding on the same topic that they have been they were taught. That basically uh, generated lot of ideas and the student and the great grand students of those teachers were successful in doing those kind of research and documenting it and were able to pass on to the next generations. So that's how some of these research and the understanding about the nature and the about their environment trickle through by their religious practices. Even though some of the practitioners were not educated, but since they have been following certain um, practices, those that information or knowledge trickle down, and that help them survive. Um, there is a, I was watching this documentary about the trees where they also mentioned that there are certain trees that has survived the great flooding that happened like 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. And these trees have roots all over the city where they are, or sometimes in the small piece of land, they are all over the country. And they are so intelligent that they preserve that memory of that great flood, and then they have passed that information to the new saplings or newer trees, and they teach them how to survive when in adverse conditions, and if there are some drought or flooding or some adverse condition, how to survive. So that idea itself is very aligned to what the pagans also believed, that even the plants have these kind of intelligence, they have sensitivity, they have knowledge, they care about others. Where so that was that I was mentioning about how some of the people were able to survive even after 1,000 years of persecution. Now, there, on the other hand, in the Western world, especially and in Africa, the pagan practices were more like the physical practices. They were not very good at documenting the stuff. So when they were attacked by the dominating parties or dominating religions, they were not able to protect the knowledge that they were carrying because their knowledgeable members of the society, their seniors, their leaders were killed, and they didn't have those kind of literature um, to basically pass on to their next generations. So that was one of the, and still, if you look at the Native Americans of America, there are certain societies cultures which are like as small as like 40, 50 people, and they have only one person in their tribe who uh, knows their native language, so they have forgotten everything, not even the customs, but even the basic um, tools of communication in their own language. um, Now, so, um, that was a little introduction of what were the reasons of some of these cultures were not able to survive and some were able to survive. Now, in the modern time, especially in America, and this is a age of information. Um, First of all, there is lot of history available on internet. So those who have forgotten their native languages and their customs and all, if um, they have access to the media, they can uh, get very well aware of what the atrocities or persecution their ancestors have gone through, first of all, their own histories, their culture, um, and um, how they have contributed um, in the past. Their ancestors have contributed to the society in the past. So that gives some inspiration and motivated them to revive this religion. Also, there is a decline of followership in the largest religion. Like there is a trend going on. People are quitting from um, Christianity or Islam and becoming atheist. Um, Spirituality is one part of human existence and survival. Um, Men always um, look for a spiritual aspect in his life. So they also look for those people who are quitting one religion or another. They uh, inspire. They have um, they are not following that particular religion, but there is a need, a spiritual need of investigate or know what are other aspects of spirituality and how to um, get knowledge about those ones. So that is also one aspect that people are getting motivated and moving towards paganism. There's some political aspect to it as well to revive the paganism. Uh, I will also talk about the legal aspect that the pagans follow. Most of these believers they believe in the karmic laws, which is the law of karma, and they believe whatever you do, that would come back in three folds. So they really want to do good to environment, good to other people, good to society, so that good will come to them. And that's their moral and ethical values as well. That is driving their society and culture. Um, there are, and they also believe in nature, and they believe the law of nature prevails, and we should not destroy nature. So if you see in some part of the world, um, people do respect plants, and water and mountains and natural resources. They even worship, especially in Hindu culture, they worship these kind of things, um, or organisms, I would say, plants and animals. Um, the but if you see the American legal system or the American society, that is mainly the Christian based society. And the motto also is like in God we believe. In what God we believe? That's a question. Definitely the Christian God. The Army of United States is the Christian Army. And But lately, if you see that army also, um, because of some political reasons or whatnot, they have introduced the pagan chaplainship also in the army. They have established, I think, a first temple in 2017, pagan temple, and they are recognizing that, yeah, there are alternative um, religions, and there is a need for a place of worship for them as well. Along with it, there are many organizations which are contributing to this. There is a organization called Academy of Arcana that has built a temple for goddess Cursiosa, and they have built a museum where they have exhibited about 350 goddesses. um, then there is convents of goddesses. They offer legally recognized clergy credentials to qualified members, and form a network of support and information of witches. So, the witchcraft is also very important uh, aspect of many pagan religions. These witches have been instrumental in providing the medical help, both by providing the herbal medicines, or um by the virtue of chanting or talismans that they call it, similar to the Hindus or the Vedic people use the chanting or the mantras for curing the diseases. So there are these institutions that are being coming up. They're providing the support of to people, both in knowledge sharing and in the training. Then there's a school called Gray School. They provide apprenticeship, um, and provide the graduate degree um, in the journeyman program, which is uh, like a, certification to a clergy. Then there are, as I mentioned, that the witches have been instrumental in the past for providing their community with herbal medicine support and the psychological treatment they have been doing. And so there has been schools, there are schools coming up that basically teaches the this witchcraft and astrology and the herbal medicine. That is the kind of information that they think that has been destroyed and a new generation should learn and practice. Um, Another example that I missed about the persecution of the Native Americans, uh, that is very prominent topic of discussion around the world, not only in America. How they have been, their culture has been destroyed, their leaders have been killed, their women and children were burnt alive and, you know, infected with various kind of diseases. Their animals were killed, their natural resources have been looted, destroyed by the colonial American society. Um, so there have been initiatives to support these American cultures, communities. Well, there are a lot of um, uh, there are a lot of industry level or you know the the companies, many companies have programs for social development and all, and they are encouraging their employees to basically educate and support these communities in various ways, like providing them modern education, financial support, and the legal aspect of it, like providing them legal knowledge and support. So that has basically increased the awareness in the society, which were not aware of all these things that has happened to their civilization, and they are very eager, like people um, who never had any interaction like me, are getting aware of what are the needs of these Native American people and how to support them, and they are eager to learn and support them. Um, that's the way some of the modern practices are evolving in the form of education and the form of non-governmental agencies who are basically bringing up these concepts and bringing um, awareness in the society and helping these communities as well. I think that's all from my side, Aditya.
Okay. So, unfortunately, Professor Nanda will not be joining today. He sent me a text message, so I'll hand over further discussion to Mr. Clemens, who is the faculty preceptor for today's seminar. Mr. Clemens.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Adinji, and also to Ripudaman for a fine presentation. I think Ripudaman covered pretty much touched upon all the main points as it relates to paganism in the Western world and America in particular. I took a few notes and I'll just make a few comments there. And then if we have time, I'd like to give some background to some of those trends. So one of the things was just about the word pagan itself. It's not really that pagan meant non-Christian. The word for a non-Christian would be heathen. That was the word for non. But pagan comes from like paganos, which means someone from the country. Uh, like in Indian language, like gawar, someone who lives, like a villager, a peasant head. And since people from the village were considered less well-groomed and educated, it was also a term of contempt. The reason it became synonymous with traditional indigenous religions in those regions was because indigenous religion had retreated to the countryside. It had been exterminated from all major population centers and the cities, basically. And it was surviving for many centuries after Christianity, as recently as 3 or 4 centuries ago in parts of Eastern Europe. It was surviving in the villages amongst the country folks. It didn't always survive in its native form, although that did survive for a very long time. But very often it survived as a what's called meso-paganism, where, and this is kind of important to understand this trajectory, because the trajectory can also be reversed, and it has to go along the same process in reverse order. So it survived, for instance, as a meso-paganism, where uh, the pagan culture, the indigenous pagan culture, adopts many of the symbols and the external aspects of the conquering culture and faith, in this case, Christianity. So, for instance, many Native Americans today, they're still pagans, but they have adopted a lot of Christian symbology as part of their faith. Or it survived as what's called syncreto-paganism, and this is even more important for us to understand. Syncreto-paganism is where, in name and form, the paganism has been exterminated, but it still informs the kind of Christianity that the people there practiced. So they have appropriated many of the pagan practices, but given it a Christian name, and it survives in that form. And so those pagan philosophical thoughts and even practices survived as an underground current of, so-called esoteric movements in the West throughout the Middle Ages, and even in the pre-modern, modern, and even today in the postmodern age. So that was the trajectory it followed.
May I interrupt you?
Yes.
Looks like Professor Nanda joined briefly.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
And since he is going to be busy in another lecture, maybe we...
Absolutely.
Adityanji, I spoke at the other one, and then I told them that I'll come and join them later, but I'm going to be with you. I listen to both of them as much as I can, and then I'll go. Thank you. I already spoke there, but I said that I'm just going to go back to this program, and then I'll come back to them later. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Sure, I'll just go ahead then, Pradhanji.
Go ahead, and after you, maybe Professor Nanda can give
Okay, okay. So I'll just quick. So that was basically the history behind the word pagan, and the way it evolved and the way it continues to survive. So even today, if you look at it in popular Western culture today, you have, like, if you say you go to Netflix today, you have 10 different Netflix series on the Vikings, which has a heavy pagan, undertones to those series. There's a lot of interest in that, and that's called paleo-paganism. Then you have the civilo-paganism of the Southern European, the Greek, the Hellenic, and the Roman philosophers and so forth. It's also important to understand that the topic of our presentation today is Western paganism, really, and as it exists in the United States. And it's important to understand the way we think of Western and Eastern today is heavily influenced by this whole Middle Ages and this polarization of East and West. But if you go to the pagan movement today in the United States, that polarization has been softened to a great extent, because Western paganism, its provenance really is not just Northern Europe and Southern Europe, but also includes the West Asia, the Middle East, large part of the Middle East, the Levant especially, and the whole of North Africa. So the West Asia and the North Africa will today not be considered West, but for pagans, it's very much a part. So Egyptian paganism, North African paganism, and the paganism of West Asia as well is very much a part of who they are, and they're all a very integrated kind of movement, as it was before the polarization between Christianity and Islam changed the definition of East and West. It's kind of very important to keep that in mind, that if paganism revives, then this hard difference between so-called East and West will also soften to a great extent, and that has multiple repercussions in terms of a Eurasian, identity. The other thing to note is that, Ripudaman touched upon how pagans consider plants and animals to also be living beings and also possess a soul, and that the scope of consciousness is not just extended to plants and animals, but also nature as a whole. So that was quite a radical thing in throughout the Middle Ages, because older forms of Christianity and Islam did not consider plants and animals to have a soul. They didn't even consider women to actually have a soul. So this was quite radical, and even in the modern age or pre-modern age, many scientists in the West did not believe that animals, for instance, experience pain in the same way that we experience pain. So that was very radical at that time. Today, of course, it's common. Most people agree with the pagan idea. Similarly, with healthcare and paganism, Ripudaman touched upon it. Paganism was a very big part of healthcare. They were systematically persecuted as witch doctors. They were eradicated even before the birth of modern Western medicine. So there was nothing better to replace it at that time. But because it continued to exert an influence upon the minds of the people, especially in the countryside, because of providing healthcare, therefore they were persecuted for that. That's another. The other aspect of this thing about consciousness and animals and plants is two very important movements here in America and in the West as a whole that are rooted in modern pagan resurgence. The first of them is called Eco-Feminism. So that's kind of an offshoot of the feminist movement in France. Eco-Feminism is a pagan movement that believes that there is a direct psychological relationship between the way a society treats nature, the ecology, and the gender relations in that society. So they feel that the gender relations in that society are, full of toxic masculinity, are extremely patriarchal, do not, where women really have no major voice. They believe that kind of a society is more likely to do a lot more damage to the ecology or to be completely negligent for the ecology. And so they believe eco-feminist movement is a pagan movement that believes that focusing on gender relations in society is not good. It is not only good for the women in that society, but is also good for that society's attitude towards nature as a whole. And parallel to ecofeminism is the goddess spirituality movement, which says that it's not just enough to legally correct gender relations in society, but also to understand God in feminine terms. In other words, typically in Christianity, we refer to God as a he, but they say to refer to God as a she causes a fundamental shift in one's consciousness, which again affects the environment and our attitude towards the ecology. So these two movements have a very powerful voice in the environmentalism and sustainable development space. And so these really deserve mention when we talk about paganism and its contribution to the mainstream discourse today in America and Western society. And finally, I just wanted to touch upon the reasons for pagan upsurge. 2 points that Ripudaman mentioned was, he talked about how there's a general atheism in America, and there's a search for spirituality, and so paganism is helping to fill that void. And then there are other political factors involved. So just to lay it out in a better way. So one is, of course, this idea that there's a reaction to this lifestyle of toxic consumerism and environmental destruction. And there's a widespread understanding today that this consumerist economy is with the corporate, government, and the church. The church is very much a big part of this abundance theology and this consumerist mindset that is driving us to environmental destruction. And so there is a disaffection with mainstream religion, and they're looking to religions that are aligned more with the earth and ecology. And so paganism is obviously a ready option. The second is reaction to the impersonal and mechanical lifestyle. And even these even religions become this canned kind of religion. It's a canned doctrine. You subscribe to it. you have some level of fellowship, and that's it. You have a membership of the right religious group, and that's it. It's a very impersonal and a doctrinaire kind of lifestyle, and paganism provides an alternative because it is very much based on the quality of discipleship and a personal relationship with your fellow disciples and with people in general. There's a big emphasis on that, and so that attracts people. The third one, and this is kind of a double-edged one, is the growth of multiculturalism in the West, with people from other non-Western areas coming and settling here. And it has consequences. So one of the positives of that is that people coming in from many other cultures, they tend to have a very strong sense of their own identity, both linguistic, religious, and they're not going to just simply assimilate into some category or the other. And so that sort of is noted by many white Westerners, and they become similarly interested in their ethnological history. They become interested in that, and in that sense they rediscover their pagan roots. That's a positive and a nice development. But the other side of that is that it has also given rise to ethno-nationalism. In other words, a sort of a hostility towards these people who look and speak different from us. And so as a counter to their identity, they have there's this white nationalism, ethno-nationalist movement here, and a lot of those tend to hark towards some kind of pagan, because you have to understand, a lot of the non-whites here are Mexican. They're also Christian, but they're not white. And so it's not just white Christian nationalism, which is also there, but pagan white nationalism that is also has a strong following here in the West and in America and Canada. And the fourth reason is the pagan undercurrents of the culture wars. So at the academic level, at the intellectual level of intellectuals, you have a lot of intellectuals who understand that the philosophical undercurrents of what makes the West what it is today, coming out of the Dark Ages, the Enlightenment, and so forth, all those philosophies borrowed heavily from pagan philosophies, or what was left of pagan philosophy. And so they delve deeper, and then they become practicing pagans, not just intellectually, but also devotionally. So I'll stop there, and if we have time later, maybe we can discuss some of the philosophical aspects of polycentricity.
Thank you, Carl. I would invite Professor Nanda to give his comments.
Adityanji, thank you very much. I'm so sorry. Pachauri, I did want to hear you, and I was planning to be there at the very beginning. And I was supposed to speak at 9 my time, and they just changed it. And so my apologies that I missed you. And you and Mr. Clemens, you know this area so well, and I don't. But at the same time, I do have a couple questions. May I ask Adityanji?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. My question simply is that today, what is the kind of impact of paganism in practical terms? Because you mentioned environmentalism, you mentioned sustainability, and these are the buzzwords today. Because from sustainable development goals to all sustainability in different forms today, that has become just the norm. But paganism as such, does it really have an impact upon these settings? Second, as you think about paganism, and you said that that ideology that today is in all this being somehow influenced by paganism, and I just want to know, in practical terms, in this in this society, do pagans and paganism, does paganism and do pagans have really had a practical impact, for example, on legislation, impact on policy decisions, impact on decision makers?
Ripudaman, did you want to take that first, or
Yeah, so
yeah?
I would like to comment on this. There are two aspects, okay? One is when we discuss about, for example, human rights, we come um, on this situation where these laws are not governed by the nature, and there are law of the land prevails. Um, so many times these rights are compromised in the absence of moral and ethical values. So the with growing paganism, um, we should expect that the moral and ethical values would come in the picture when we try to address the issues related to many of the issues related to environment and the other human rights. One thing is this. Another aspect of it is, as Mr. Carl was mentioning about the consumerism, and it is very much the society, the American Western society is very much driven by the church. Even um, previously, the scientific research was also very much supported by the church. Um, Anyways, so the nature of the this whole the political system in the church was uh, ethnocentric, means they wanted to implement the ideas that they believe in that they believe in, where uh, using this using different tools like their language, their behavior, their dressing sense. If the religion is spreading in other parts of the world, they wanted that to be spread along with all those ideas. Means if um, uh, a Western person is wearing a particular kind of dress, they expect an African to also wear that kind of dress. But with the consumerism, uh, it there was a shift in their attitude, and it became a polycentric. They gave leniency to the believers, the new believers of their um, religion. For example, in India, you will see a Christian would wear a dhoti and also be wearing a tilak. But if he goes to the church, he would leave his shoes outside. In some part of the Indian states, you'll see these practices. Similarly, in other part of the world, in like in Islam also, this has happened. They become lenient, and they let people to follow their own language, to follow their own behavior and culture and custom, along with the following of their religious books. That would not only spread their own religion, but also helps the capitalism. So the people would associate themselves with a capitalist big enough who can provide a support, and also they in many ways they are using their products, and the spreading their products and earn them business. So I think these are the two main aspects. If I have answered Dr. Nanda's
Thank you.
questions.
Carl, do you want to take a?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a couple of things, just to give a couple of concrete examples. So, apart from the environmental, sustainable development, and human rights space, which has a proportion of pagan activists far in excess of their proportion in the population, I'll give some examples of legal successes and some legislative successes, as well as uh, talk in the academic community, which has the potential to have some effect. So, for instance, simple things like pagan marriages were not legal earlier, but a few years back there was a New York lawyer um, who was a Wiccan, I believe her name is Phyllis Curott, and she fought a battle to legalize pagan marriages and for Wiccans and other pagans to perform marriages and for those marriages to be legal. So that was one legal success. Another example was a lot of pagan ceremonies were considered illegal. You could be put in jail. And in fact, a prominent pagan priestess, Susanna Budapest, she was jailed in LA because a lot of these pagan practices were associated with divination, which was, and there were laws against divination. And so a lot of pagan practices were, you could just be put in jail if you were found. So she fought a 9-year legal battle. This was in the 1980s, and finally got those laws against divination overturned. Similarly, for something as simple as wearing pagan costume, like for a pagan priestess or priest to wear pagan costume, there were laws against that. You were called witches. So although witches were not being hanged like in Salem, but still, if you were found wearing a witch's costume, you could be put in jail. So there was, in Massachusetts, there was a fight against that, and they overturned those laws. Um, Recently, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has laid out laws that pagan employees should not be discriminated at the workplace for being pagan, because there's been a slew of such persecution going on at the workplace. And a pagan can legally ask for leave on a certain number of pagan holidays, and employers in the United States now are duty bound to give them leave. So that's just a few examples in the legal space. In the academic space, and again, a lot of this is being led by lawyers. For instance, Stephen D. Smith, the law professor at the University of San Diego, and he's the author of a book called Pagans and Christians in the City: Culture Wars from the Tiber to the Potomac. And he writes that in America, this monotheistic Christian part of Western civilization has always had a sort of uneasy tension with this liberal democratic aspect of aspect of Western civilization. And he points out that a lot of this coming out of the the Dark Ages through the Enlightenment and the establishment of Western democracy today has drawn upon pagan undercurrents. And he feels that going forward, especially in a multicultural society, he feels that paganism would be a much better alternative as a civic religion for Americans than Christianity and the others. And his book and his kind of thinking has gained a lot of attention. Similarly, a former Yale Law School dean, Anthony Kronman, wrote a book called Confessions of a Born Again Pagan. And he again talks about the same thing. He says that not just a pre-modern and modern, but also postmodern, today's philosophers, they draw heavily upon pagan undercurrents. And he thinks that if we're going to draw on their intellectual resources, why not also on their devotional tradition? And so there's a lot of this churn going on in the academic space also, which is not insignificant.
I'm going to invite Professor Pathak because he has been working with indigenous cultures and ancient philosophical traditions because it has a very strong bearing on pagan cultures, or as we understand pagan culture. So, Professor Pathak, we would like you to give your comments.
Pathak, you enlighten us.
I think you are.
Pathak, you're mute.
Please unmute yourself, Professor Pathak.
Yes.
But can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
You know, I have a couple of things to share with you. First thing is that paganism is defined in many different ways, because the concept of paganism started being used in the 4th century when people from those who were Christians started moving towards Europe. They found out people who are practicing many different ways, and polytheism was part of that. There was no gender bias as far as the god and goddesses are concerned. So it's very interesting that when you look at America and the paganism, if you apply the definition of paganism, one of the definitions says that those who are not converted into Christianity, Islam, or Judaism are all pagans. So obviously, Indians who are residing in America will also be part of the paganism. Paganism, when you consider it, it should not be considered as a religion, but it should be considered as a way of life. And that's why, in case of, I have been organizing so many conferences, and we are very closely associated with World Council of Ethnic Religions, and now it has become European Council of Ethnic Religions. And the president of this WCER, his name used to be Jonas Tinkunas, and we invited his wife in ICHRRF. I hope you remember Inia was here. So the paganism is growing in America probably because all these non-Abrahamic religions are growing. The people are participating. So Hindus are contributing more than 1,000 temples here. So if we want to connect with all these people, they all are thinking alike, most of them. And in case of ICCS, we normally use the term called ancient traditions. And believe it or not, but I will request Dr. Adityanji and introduce him to Major Mathur, who has done a lot of work on the paganism and similarities with. And some of the commonalities are like Romua language. Romua is a traditional pagan movement in Lithuania. Their language contains more than 30% Sanskrit words. And we used to have Vasuvaji here, and Carl might be knowing Vasuvaji. But Vasuvaji had conducted Sanskrit, spoken Sanskrit classes for pagan people in Massachusetts, because Boston has a big population of pagan people there. And we are very closely associated with them. So, paganism, I think we should consider as a way of life. Paganism is in the modern context, anybody who is not converted to the Abrahamic religion is a pagan, and that helps us to build up more bridges with all these people and bring more polycentricity, as this is a favorite word of Carl Clemens. Uh, and that will really help us. So, at ICHRRF, when we started, we were also thinking about putting up all these activities, and ICHRRF will provide a forum for all the pagans, and they will be very useful to us. I think collaborating with them and connecting with them and understanding them as a way of life will help us to understand more about polycentricity and paganism, growing paganism in United States.
Thank you, Professor Pathak. So we have few people left who have not spoken. I would like to invite our newest fellow, Anushri, if she has any comments or observations or questions.
Adityanji. I was just trying to understand as to, one can see that if native pagan traditions are coming under attack, if a state is theocratic, then there is some logical connection to it. But what about the case if state is not theocratic or state is proclaiming itself to be secular state? Then what is the condition of native pagan traditions in that Western society? That was something I was curious about.
I can tell you that there are very few Western societies that are not theocratic. Even United States, which considers separation of church and state, still says that the whole country is founded on Judeo-Christian traditions. And although it is kind of not enshrined in the Constitution, but at least they still say, they proclaim they believe in God we trust. So it's a very interesting this thing that there's a marriage of convenience between Judeo-Christianity and so-called secular American state. Most of the modern Western democracies, European democracies are actually theocracies. United Kingdom is a theocratic state. There's a state religion. So I think it's a kind of hypothetical question to have quote unquote secular Western states. Reality is totally different, whatever may be the intentions. I'm going to invite Mr. Harilal Patel, who has joined us very recently as treasurer of the ICHRRF. He actually has a lot of experience working in interfaith groups. So probably he may have interacted in those interfaith groups with pagan traditions and pagan, believers or pagan practitioners. Mr. Patel, would you like to make some comments?
Well, I have one, well, good evening, everybody. We had invited American Indian to give a lecture to all of us and explain from Massachusetts to Midwest how the American Indians are faring compared to the western part of the USA. And he elaborated for last 300 years of history of his parents and also his tribe. I live in Pittsburgh, and in Pittsburgh there is an organization which essentially they call themselves American Indian, but you can call them Pagan in this particular terms because they follow. I had a personal talk with him, and they follow essentially what we Hindu do is a nature worshipping. And then we had discussion about how about the other tribes in the western part of the country. He said our culture essentially is all same. Doesn't matter what tribe we are from, Dakotas or from Arizona. Every one of them have almost the same religious culture. Just it is a geographically they happen to settle in different area and believe little bit differently, but essentially same. Now, it is very interesting. We discuss about the pagan from 3rd century and 4th century. Pagans are still striving. I read some article occasionally. In Europe, it is on a rise right now. You mentioned about it is rise in USA, and Dr. Pathak mentioned about it, that any who is not Abrahamic is pagan. But in Europe, it is not Abrahamic, non-Abrahamic. It is the original white who converted into Christianity are going back and looking for their own roots, and they are on a rise recently. So paganism is actually on a rise, maybe all over the world on a smaller scale. But in Europe, it is much faster scale compared to rest of the thing that was the article was talking about it.
Thank you, Mr. Patel, for very enlightened comments. The only person who has not commented is Dr. Raghunath Kochar, who is an Afghan Hindu based in New Delhi. Dr. Kochar, would you like to say any comments or make any observations on the topic of pagan cultures? I think he just unmuted himself. Dr. Kochar, do you have any comments, sir?
Sir, no, I am still trainer on veganism.
Okay. I will probably make a few comments.
Yeah, please.
And I will take a rather global perspective and not just US or Western perspective. So Professor Pathak has very well defined what are pagan cultures. And Mr. Clemens defined what is heathenism and what was originally paganism. I don't like the term paganism because there is no central thesis. I use the term pagan cultures, or one might say a group of paganisms, because these are diverse practices and diverse cultures, which may be geographically based. Till the advent of Semitic religions, pretty much entire humanity followed, one way or the other, some pagan-like belief system, and the oldest of which is Sanatana Dharma, which traveled pretty much everywhere, all parts of the world. And you will see the influences. Professor Pathak talked about Romuva religion. If I may go to East, in Japan, Shintoism is basically pagan or Sanatana Dharma in a different form. So, with the oppression of the ancient traditions by new organized religions of the book, leading to persecution and genocide of ancient traditions, people professing ancient traditions in Middle Ages and medieval times, all the pagan cultures, all the pagan belief systems either were exterminated or went underground except for Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma, or even the offshoots of Sanatana Dharma, the new religious movements, NRMs, that started as new religious movements and then became distinct religious entities in their own, at least at this point in time, and those are Indic religions, basically Jainism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. So everywhere else, the pagan traditions were suppressed, legally not allowed to be practiced. And Mr. Clemens talked about that, whether you call it divination or whether you call it witches or whether you call it, hillbillies or things like that. Fact of the matter is that there was no freedom of religion. There was no freedom of belief in the medieval time in countries that were dominated by Semitic religions. With the post-World War II generations, when democracy came in vogue and the Western world renounced violence following, at least in theory, following the Holocaust, there was a neo-pagan counter reaction to Semitic religions or the religions of the book. And in socio-anthropological terms, you are seeing a new resurgence of ancient traditions. And you are seeing it in all geographical areas of the world, whether that is United States or whether it is Europe. If you look at Asia, again, the same thing is happening in Asia. A country that has been converted to Islam, like Indonesia, there is strong resurgence of their ancient traditions. And in order to qualify as the status of state religion, they were asked, if you are a religion, how would you, what is your book? book of beliefs, what is your church, or what is your religious organization or structure. And in fact, they had to piggyback on Hinduism in the island of Borneo to be to be officially recognized as a state religion. So it is happening everywhere where oppression of the Semitic religions prevailed as the state power, as the dominant power. Carl talked about ethno-paganism, white ethno-paganism. But you see in the Western sphere also examples of black ethno-paganisms. So you look at Rastafarians. What are Rastafarians? It's a neo-pagan counter-reaction to Christianity. You look at Back to Africa movement, in African American community. And you look at Wiccans. Wiccans are essentially white ethno-pagans movements. There's something very interesting going on. Essentially, all the pagan ways of life and pagan cultures and pagan traditions did not have a centralized church, did not have a codified book. But the neo-pagan traditions are undergoing churchification and Semitization, whether that is in United States for Wiccan religion. I use the example of island of Borneo, the ancient Indonesian tradition. But you look at some of the established Indic religions in the East, pretty much Sikh faith has become Semitized as they practice it at this point in time by introducing the concept of sacrilege and ordained punishment for sacrilege. Similarly, Buddhist thought has become Semitized, revolving around just one person and his revelation as the true revelations. So you are seeing some of the Indic faiths that arose as new religious movements, as offshoots of Sanatana Dharma, are no longer actually pagan in nature. They have become churchified and Semitized by having a very centralized hierarchy, definitely a book in case of Sikh religion, and very severe punishments for non-believers or those who are perceived to have insulted the religious traditions. So the concept of blasphemy and sacrilege and beadbi or whatever have been introduced. So what we are seeing in the marketplace of religions, a neo-pagan counter-reaction to Semitic religions. But we are also seeing, commercialization of concept of Sanatana Dharma as avant-garde philosophies in terms of eco-feminism, because Western people, Western race, Caucasian race, will never give its due to the divine femininity, the culture, the tradition of Shakti as part of Sanatana Dharma. And what they would do is to cleave, repackage, and claim to be as a avant-garde, modern, futuristic idea, whether that is veganism, environmentalism, ecofeminism, all those things. There's a very interesting anthropological phenomenon that is being observed at this point in time, that the Western pagans would not like to do anything, would not like to identify with Sanatan Dharma, which is the oldest pagan tradition existing. And just like their Christian or Islamic or Judaic colleagues, they indulge in browbeating the oldest nature worshipping, liberal, polytheistic, philosophical tradition called Hindu Dharma or Sanatan Dharma. So if you talk to Wiccans, they will morally sermonize Sanatan Dharma about caste system and this and that. And they would not identify that Sanatan Dharma is the oldest living pagan tradition. So from a sociological and anthropological perspective, there is definitely resurgence of pagan traditions. We should understand that these are diverse polytheistic traditions. They may be geographically based, they may be, based on certain other notions, artificially contrived notions. And that is bound to happen as people get freedom to practice their thought or belief in democracies. Outside democracy, probably it's very difficult. And you see in 57 countries, OIC members, where no other religion is allowed to be practiced, you do not have, thriving situation as far as pagan religions are concerned or pagan way of thinking is concerned. You might conceptualize Baha'i tradition as more akin to pagan way of life, accepting the divinity of every religious tradition. But Baha'is are persecuted in Islamic world. The ancient pagan tradition of West Asia, the Yazidis and their, religion continues to be, oppressed, suppressed, and subject to persecution. And we don't see any kind of, voice or murmur of protest from the Western human right industry. So again, the idea of bringing this fellowship training seminar for discussion was to understand how pagan ways of life are seeing a resurgence, how the state-based, theocratic states have oppressed these traditions, and even in so-called liberal democracies, there is othering of the pagan traditions, and even in pagan traditions, ethno-based superiority that is being claimed by Wiccans or some other pagan belief systems vis-a-vis Sanatan Dharma, that is hard to digest, although it is very easy to understand where it is coming from. So we need to understand that paganism is not a religion, is not a single religious tradition. These are basically ancient, pre-Semitic, pre-Christian, pre-Islamic, pre-Judaic, ancient philosophical practices. And what we are seeing is a resurgence of these practices pretty much all over the world. Whether you look at ethnicities, white pagan movements or black pagan movements or pagan movements in Asia or West Asia, East, everywhere we are seeing a resurgence in going back to the traditions, original traditions. And I think there will be a time when countries that have a state religion that are oppressive, they'll be forced to change the system. I think time has come when people are able to say enough. This is not the way to treat humanity. Just because people have a different viewpoint, you cannot slaughter them. And I think that kind of counter reaction, that kind of protest is starting to happen. So my hope is that we will be able to bring all the pagan traditions on the single platform and also in various interfaith activities without fear, without shame, without embarrassment, and without the pejorative connotation that the word paganism or pagan or heathen connote to the people who believe in the religions of the book. So we have to humanize and normalize the spirituality of people that believe in diverse traditions and give them due credit for their traditions. Simultaneously, we also have to be very wary that, in the marketplace of spirituality, people are not parsing out one or two tradition, starting that as a new movement, new idea, newfangled ideas, and taking the credit for that. I think with those comments, we will try to end this seminar. It has been a very enlightening discussion. So thank you to everyone, especially Ripudaman Pachauri and Mr. Clemens, and to Professor Nanda for being able to take time from his numerous lectures.
I'm going to go to the other one now. Thank you for now.
Just to remind everyone, Professor Nanda will be giving a lecture to PEDS tomorrow. I think it is on the House
10:30.
Resolution 1156. So I think the notice has been circulated in various WhatsApp groups. Those of you who have time, please pre-register. It requires pre-registration. There won't be any direct link if you don't pre-register. So
You have to register. So Adityanji, thank you. I'll have to leave to go back to the other one.
thank you very much indeed. So we are going to call it a day. Our attendance has dwindled from 10 to 6. So that's an indication that we should shut up and go back. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all.